Hey everybody, Matt Barton here, your principal broker with this week's Broker Minute or Two. So we're going to start with just a little bit of a story here. We had a opportunity to have Craig Wagner come and teach our mandatory CE course, which was fantastic. Appreciate Craig doing that. But in the course of that mandatory course, a question came up, and it's one that I get all the time. And so I wanted to make sure that I use that opportunity to expound on an idea here, and it deals with agency, written agreements, and when, right? So in the course of the class that Craig was teaching, he brought this up and he related his personal experience, which is, hey, here are the rules related to that. And oh, by the way, I've talked with Katie Wright. For those of you who don't know, Katie Wright is the lead investigator at the DRE. And she said, well, we don't really scrutinize on that, and that was the basis for Craig saying, well, just make sure you get it before you write an offer. And I had some consternation with that. I let him continue his presentation. I went up to him and spoke with him at one of the breaks and actually showed him something on the DRE had published. And he said, oh, well, okay, maybe I need to change how I teach this. So I wanted to bring that up on screen and show you. So this goes back to one of the quarterly newsletters that were put out. And Kagi's Corner, Ben Kagi's one of the investigators. He's been there forever. And he took this one head on. And the title of the article is Written Agency Agreements Are Required. So I want to draw attention to these first two highlights I have because I think they're the most important ones. And I'm going to read them verbatim. The division receives questions on agency agreements on a consistent basis. I can attest to that. These are one of the top three things that I deal with as a principal broker. And would like to take this opportunity to remind all licensees about the requirement of obtaining written agency prior to representing a real estate client, right? So versus what Craig's experience was talking to an investigator, this is actually what they put in writing, and then they go on to cite the code. So I just want to make the point that this is way more governing than somebody's opinion in class, even if they are an attorney. The second paragraph, all licensees who represent a client in a residential, commercial, real estate sale or property management or lease transaction are required to have a written agency agreement prior to representing the client as defined in the following administrative rules and statutes. So before we jump into those real quickly, think about this. It only makes sense. You don't go in after you've represented somebody and say, oh, by the way, here are my responsibilities to you. The very nature of this requirement is so that the public knows what fiduciaries we have to them, right, before we start acting as their agent. All right, so the actual rules, it's really Rule 2 and then Rule 6, right? So Rule 2 is the first one and says, for the purpose of defining the scope of an individual's agency, execute a written agency agreement between the individual and the principal. Okay, and then later on, there's several rules in between this, and then it says later on, prior to executing a binding purchase agreement, disclose in writing to clients, agents, and the other parties and unrepresented parties the following things. Think Section 5 of the REPC. So clearly the division has this broken out in two separate rules. One is when you start acting as their agent, you're to have it in writing. Then when we get to a REPC and you affirm that agency again in Section 5. So I wanted to make sure that that was clear. And then in this article, it goes one step further. And if you do limited agency over here on the right, agents, you need to have the following: agency agreement with buyer and seller, and oh, by the way, limited agency disclosure. And here's the key point, and it kind of parallels what we were talking about on just regular agency. You must get that limited agency disclosure signed prior to the informed consent, right? It makes no sense when you think about it to get, okay, a licensee functioned as a limited agent for a good period of time. And oh, by the way, as the transaction's closing, oh, by the way, would you sign this understanding that I can't fulfill all my fiduciaries outlined here below, undivided loyalty, absolute confidentiality, full disclosure, and obtaining written acknowledgement of each party affirming that they understand those things. You can't do those after the fact. It defeats the purpose of having your agency or your limited agency known up front. So hopefully that clears up some questions that have arisen over time. I get these questions all the time. And I would just finish with this. it's not just an administrative rule that we're concerned about here and getting in the crosshairs of the division. With a lot of the rules, if we shirk our responsibilities, our fiduciary responsibilities, it's possible that we then can get lumped into civil litigation, right? When somebody signs an agreement with us, or if we start working in an implied agency capacity, if we haven't done our job correctly and explained our fiduciaries, it's quite possible when something goes sideways that we can get lumped into the litigation. So for two reasons, we want to make sure we do this right? Making sure the public is informed of what our relationship is and to head off any liability in litigation. So if you have any questions about agency, man, I'd love to have that talk with you and make sure we're all on the same page. Aside from that, have a great week and we'll talk with you soon.